Well, good evening. Happy Christmas. Oh, this is apple and ginger, by the way. Not non-alcoholic. I hope you can see these books piled up on my drawing board here. Some of my Lord Dunsany collection. Some of them are very old. I've had them wrapped up in plastic for decades. This one is The Book of Wonder from 1912, illustrated by Sidney Syme, who was Dunsany's preferred illustrator. And, you know, I've always fancied emulating him. In fact, I've been illustrating Lord Dunsany's work as an amateur all my adult life. So I was absolutely thrilled to be able to get permission from the current Lord Dunsany to read one of his stories, which is from this little book, the second ghost book, edited by Lady Cynthia Asquith. This one was published in 1956. And I may not be the best reader in the world, but I hope you're going to enjoy this little story. Autumn Cricket by Lord Dunsany. On one of those short journeys by car that one sometimes takes nowadays, I happened to pass, after nightfall, the once famous cricket field of Longbarrow. They play there still in the summer, though not so much as they used to do, but this was autumn, when it would be deserted by day, and at night there was nothing there but grey mists that had strayed up from a neighbouring stream that winds along under the willows at one end of the ground. Perhaps it was the contrast between the activity for which that field had been famous and the loneliness of it that autumn night that made me feel for a moment a sense of desolation. And then my headlights flashed on the face of an old man sitting on a wooden bench by the side of the field and gazing out into the mists, whose shapes floated up from the stream and rose every now and then in little wraiths as a breeze in the cold night played with them for a while and soon dropped them again. Somehow this solitary figure there seemed to increase the loneliness. Then, just before the light left him, to sweep on and illuminate hedges and branches of trees, the old man began to clap. Sitting all alone on that wooden bench, looking over an empty field, he was unmistakably applauding something. I went on in the car, and that was all the story I had to tell. A field at night, covered with mist, nothing else there, and a man beside it clapping, and not a very likely story either. But I told it, such as it was, to a friend next day who knew Longbarrow, living nearer to it than I do, and this is what he told me. Oh, that would be old Modger's, he said. He used to be a groundsman there, but retired on account of age long ago, and has a cottage almost beside it. What was he doing out there at that hour, I asked. Well, that's the trouble, he said. It's not good for him at that age to be out in the cold like that, and we can't stop him unless we have him legally restrained. But surely you can't shut a man up, I said, merely to prevent him from going out in the cold. Well, it's more than that, he said. The old man thinks there's a cricket match going on there every night, and he goes out to look at it. Who does he think is playing, I asked. W.G. Grace, he replied, and Gunn, and a lot of other famous players, all of them many seen on that ground, and all of them dead. We're trying to have him certified, and then they'll be able to keep him in at night. Will he like that? I said, rather lamely. No, he said, he wants to go and see ghosts playing cricket. But it's the only way to stop him. His wife can't do it. Can you do it on that? I asked. His doctor says so, said Meadley. That was my friend's name. He said he's given him very detailed accounts of the games that he watches, even to the score of each ghost. So I imagined that I was never likely to see any more of old Modgers. And then, one day only a week or so later, when autumn was a little colder and mistier, I was passing that way after nightfall again, and there was the same old man, sitting on his old wooden bench that was still by the side of the ground, and gazing steadily, just as he had before, at the wisps of mist that breezes lifted over the rest and let fall again into the greyness that went all the way to the stream. So they had not certified the old man, and he was still out there of a night in the cold. Next day I decided to go to Meadsley's house to ask him more of the story, the beginnings of which he had told me. I rang his bell, and he came to the door himself, and I apologised for disturbing him, and told him that old Modgers was still there at night. Come in, he said cheerily, and have some tea, and I'll tell you about him. And I went into his smoking room with him, and sat down in a comfortable chair, and he said the trouble was that one doctor cannot certify a man. It takes two. That is the law. And the old fellow found out that he was going to be certified, and when the second doctor turned up, he wouldn't say a word about ghosts. So in spite of the evidence of his own doctor, we've been unable to get him into an asylum. Well, I suppose we'd all try to escape that if we could, I said. Well, it isn't the asylum that he jibs at, said Meadley, but he won't leave his ghosts. You see, he's somewhere in his late 80s and kept that ground for nearly 50 years and played on it before that, and to give up cricket is to him what giving up much more important things would be to others, and he thinks he's still watching it. Of course, if we could prove that, we could get him certified, but we can't. His doctor had the whole story from him, but that's not enough. We've asked his wife to wrap him up as much as possible, and she does that, but we can't stop him. Perhaps it would be possible to reason with him, I said, as tea was brought in by a maid. I don't think so, he said. Well, I'd like to try, I told him. He can't wait to be frozen to death. Men don't like to be killed by any of their follies, said Meadley, but they don't like to give them up. And I suppose more good advice is wasted on asking them if they wouldn't like to do so than on anything in the world. Still, I'd like to try, I said. And so I added myself to the number of those who ask men to give up the harmful things they like most in life, 1 in every 100,000 of whom succeed. So why shouldn't I? I went over by bus next night to Longbarrow, an hour or two after sunset, and walked alone to the cricket ground. And sure enough, he was on his usual bench, looking out over the famous ground at the first thin wisps of mist that were coming up from the stream and nearing the lonely pitch. I went up to the wooden bench and sat down beside him. He hastily looked all round, evidently to satisfy himself that 2 men were not within hearing, and not till he had thoroughly scrutinised the misty darkness did he say anything to me. But then he spoke. They're just coming in to bat, he said. That's Gunn, and there's W.G. So I see, I replied. You know them then, he asked. By sight, I said. Oh, they often play here, he told me. Do you watch them often, I asked. Whenever they play, he said. Is it a good thing to be out so late with all this mist rising, I asked him. Well, they never play by day, he said. But are you sure you are warm enough? I asked. Oh, I wrap up well, he said, and I never stay more than 2 hours, unless it's a very exciting game, and I go to bed as soon as I get home. He stopped to clap then, gazing over the ground towards the approaching mist, and I thought over what he had said, and it seemed to me that if he was really well wrapped up under the good greatcoat that he wore, and if he did not stay more than 2 hours, it might not be so serious as Meadley and others feared, at any rate not till the winter. And so I told Meadley the next day. I sat there beside the old fellow for nearly half an hour and heard an excellent summary of a very exciting game, something I suppose that had remained in his memory, which was still fresh and vivid, whatever had happened to the rest of his mind, perhaps overweighted and upset by the sheer power of that part of the brain that stores and preserves past days. It was really a very exciting match. I remember it yet. WG won, though that proves nothing, because he nearly always did. I saw Modger's home, hale and hearty, and I went to Meadley next day and urged him to leave the old man alone, at least till winter came, and told him that I felt sure he would be all right. And I think I persuaded Meadley. But long before winter was here, the old man died. What happened, as we afterwards heard from his wife, was only a fortnight later, being a bit older than Meadley had thought, he reached his 90th birthday. And old Mrs. Modgers told us that on that very evening, while they were having a bit of a supper and a glass of wine with which to celebrate the occasion, the mist having risen, as it always did in the autumn, but no higher than one of their windows, old Modgers had glanced out of the window and suddenly said they'd made him an honorary member of the ghosts who used to play at Long Barrow because he was 90. And Modgers had said that this was a great honour because he was the only living man that had been invited to play at night on that ground. And they were going to play that night, Modgers had said, and the doctor himself, that is Dr. Grace, had invited Modgers to play for him. And so Modgers had gone. She couldn't stop him. And this time he wouldn't even dress up warm. Well, she said he went out there with his bat, for he had an old bat that he still kept in a cupboard. And he said he wouldn't want pads because the ball they were using wasn't as hard as all that. And he went out to the pitch and bent down, like as if he was batting, and began hitting about. But surely, Meadley said to her, he didn't run. He seemed to be hitting boundaries, said Mrs. Modgers. I stayed and watched the whole time, but he wouldn't allow me to bring him home. He seemed to be hitting boundaries, and so did the gentleman opposite to him, whoever that may have been, or perhaps I should have said whatever, seeing they were all ghosts, but for him. But after he'd hit about 20 of them, he seemed to get tired, and not to be able to hit so far, and then he had to run. I couldn't stop him. And after a while he took off his hat 2 or 3 times and looked around about him, seemingly very pleased, and I think he had got his century. And that was when it happened. Of course, a man of his age couldn't run like he did, and he dropped dead. I could do nothing. We both made those vain attempts that people sometimes make with words, trying to comfort Mrs. Modgers. But though we knew we could bring her no comfort whatever, we both of us saw a gleam on her face that seemed, faint though it was, to shine from a hidden smile as she said, they were never able to shut him up, and he'll be able to play at Long Barrow now with the doctor and Mr. Gunn whenever he likes.